So there's a question that shows up in almost every CRNA school interview. And to be honest, you've probably given norepinephrine hundreds of times. You know what it does. You've watched the map climb on the monitor after you titrate it up. But when you're in your CRNA school interview and the faculty member says, okay, but why does this work? What's happening inside the cell when norepinephrine binds to its receptor? That's the question that can set people apart. And today I'm going to give you a framework you can walk into interview with, and one that covers every major vasopressor at the depth that they're actually trying to assess you for in your CRNA school interview. I'm Sachi, a practicing CRNA and founder of the CRNA Club. We built the only all-in-one application platform for ICU nurses on the path to CRNA school. You can check the links below. You can try it free for 7 days. If you're preparing for CRNA school interviews, we put out new content every week. We've got a ton of resources for you on the platform, like a mock interview tool, a whole bunch of lessons in our learning library, and a ton of great downloads and study guides for you. So definitely go check it out. All right, so before we touch a single drug, let's refresh ourselves on the equation. I know you know this, but just to refresh, MAP equals cardiac output times systemic vascular resistance. Every vasopressor and inotrope works by moving one or more parts of this equation. Some primarily raise the cardiac output, some do both, and the ratio shifts depending on the dose. And if you can look at any drug that you're giving and immediately say which variable it moves, you've already answered most of what an interviewer will ask. But you need to know which variable. You need to understand what receptor the drug hits and what the receptor does at the cellular level. It's a piece that a lot of people stress about and they kind of avoid studying, but this is the depth that the interviewers are testing. So we're going to go over that today. So let's talk about the alpha-1 receptor. The alpha-1 receptor sits on vascular smooth muscle cells, the cells that make up the walls of your arteries. So when norepinephrine binds to an alpha-1 receptor, it activates a G-alpha-Q protein inside the cell. That G-Q protein triggers phospholipase C, which splits a membrane lipid into two second messengers, IP3 and DAG. IP3 tells the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium into the cytoplasm. That calcium binds calmodulin, which activates myosin light chain kinase, and that is what causes the smooth muscle to contract. So smooth muscle contraction means vasoconstriction, SVR goes up, and then MAP goes up. So when an interviewer asks why norepinephrine raises the blood pressure, the answer isn't it causes vasoconstriction. The answer is GQ signaling, IP3, calcium, myosin light chain kinase, smooth muscle contracts, SVR rises. That is the level that they want. All right, so now let's talk about the beta-1 receptors. These are in the myocardium, and beta-1 activation triggers a GS protein, which stimulates adenylyl cyclase to convert ATP into cyclic AMP. That cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A, which phosphorylates calcium channels on the myocardial cell membrane. So more calcium enters, the heart contracts harder, and that is positive inotropy. The SA node fires faster, and that's positive chronotropy. Cardiac output goes up. So beta-1 also lives in the kidneys. That's where it triggers renin release, which starts the angiotensin cascade, which eventually raises aldosterone and retains sodium and water. It's a little bonus piece that interviewers will love if you can also draw in as well. So now, next, let's talk about the beta-2 receptor. Beta-2 does something a little counterintuitive. So it also increases cyclic AMP, same GS pathway as beta-1, but in smooth muscle, elevated cyclic AMP inhibits myosin light chain kinase instead of activating it. Cyclic AMP has different downstream effects depending on where it is. It's kind of an important and tricky nuance, but important to understand. Less kinase activity means that the smooth muscle relaxes, causes bronchodilation, peripheral vasodilation, and SVR goes down. So beta-2 does the opposite of alpha-1 in the blood vessels, even though they share parts of the same signaling pathway. The difference is the cell type and what the downstream proteins do with that cyclic AMP signal. Remember, I just said cyclic AMP can have different effects depending on where it is. That distinction, it's very important, but that will definitely trip people up. So now let's talk about norepinephrine. Strong alpha 1, strong beta 1, and essentially no beta 2. It is potent vasoconstriction from alpha 1, moderate increase in contractility from beta 1, and no peripheral vasodilation to counter it. So SVR climbs significantly. The net heart rate effect is usually a slight decrease because baroreceptors in the aortic arch detect the pressure rising and fire a reflex that flows the SA node through increased parasympathetic tone. So you get reflex bradycardia. Not really a direct drug effect, it's a compensatory baroreceptor reflex. That's why norepinephrine is first line for septic shock, right? Sepsis crashes SVR through massive vasodilation, norepinephrine rebuilds it. The beta 1 component also supports contractility when sepsis-induced cardiomyopathy is present, which shows up in about 20% of septic shock patients. All right, so if you're finding this helpful, this is a good moment to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment below on which is the most commonly used vasopressor that you use in your ICU. All right, so now let's talk about epinephrine. Epinephrine hits all 4 receptors, right? And the key difference from norepinephrine is it has meaningful beta 2 activity. So at lower doses, beta 2 vasodilation in the periphery can actually drop SVR, even as cardiac output is climbing. So MAP may barely move at low doses, even though the heart is working harder. At higher doses, alpha 1 vasoconstriction takes over and SVR climbs. That dose-dependent shift is kind of what's important for you to be picking up clinically. It's also why epinephrine is first line for anaphylaxis, right? You want all 4 effects firing simultaneously, reversing the vasodilation through alpha 1, supporting the heart through beta 1, opening the airways through beta 2, and blunting that mast cell degranulation. And so one side effect that is important is that epinephrine causes a transient lactate rise. So the mechanism isn't ischemia. Beta 2 stimulation drives aerobic glycolysis in skeletal muscle. So more pyruvate gets produced than pyruvate dehydrogenase can process. So pyruvate diverts into the lactic pathway. It normalizes within about 24 hours on its own. So next up, one of the favorites in the operating room is phenylephrine. Now, this might be too weak of a drug for you to be using in an ICU, but we use it a lot in the OR, so we're going to go over this. So phenylephrine is a pure alpha 1. There is no beta activity at all. SVR goes up, heart rate goes down from baroreceptor reflex. That's how I know my phenylephrine is kicking in without even looking or cycling a blood pressure. I can hear the pulse ox tone modulation. I can hear the heart rate dropping. Then I know when my blood pressure cycles again, my blood pressure is going to be up. Cardiac output usually stays flat or decreases as afterload is higher and there's no beta 1 to compensate. That's why phenylephrine works really well in specific situations like hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. We love it for aortic stenosis, of course, intraoperative hypotension with tachycardia, right? Because we get that nice bradycardia. And it's really a poor choice when we already have a pretty low cardiac output. You know, you're squeezing these pipes harder against a pump that is already struggling. All right, vasopressin, another one of my favorites. So vasopressin operates through a completely different receptor family. No adrenergic activity. It binds V1A receptors on vascular smooth muscle. V1A is GQ coupled. It's the same intracellular cascade as alpha 1. You got IP3 and calcium comes out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, smooth muscle contracts, and SVR goes up. There's no direct cardiac effect and no heart rate change. The main reason vasopressin matters specifically in septic shock is sepsis depletes the body's own vasopressin stores, right? The posterior pituitary gets emptied out. So when you add vasopressin at 0.03 units per minute in septic shock, you're not adding a vasopressor necessarily. Well, you are, but you know what I mean. You're replacing a hormone that the body ran out of. So this kind of reframe also explains why vasopressin holds up better in acidosis, right? V1 receptors are more resistant to acidemia than alpha 1 adrenergic receptors. So when norepinephrine is losing its punch in severe acidosis, vasopressin is still probably going to be doing something. Okay, next let's talk about dobutamine and milrinone. Both dobutamine and milrinone increase cardiac output. Both can drop SVR, but through completely different mechanisms. And that difference is important for us to talk about. So dobutamine is a beta-1 agonist. It hits the receptor, activates G-alpha S, raises cyclic AMP, increases intracellular calcium in the myocardium, which gives us that stronger contraction. And I know I'm repeating myself a lot here, but by the end of this episode, I'm hoping that you'll really start to ingrain in your mind this pathway. Cyclic AMP, calcium, right? Protein kinase C. All of these words start to trigger, and this all starts to make a little more sense. There is some beta 2 activity that vasodilates peripherally, so SVR can drop at lower doses. Milrinone, on the other hand, doesn't touch adrenergic receptors. It inhibits phosphodiesterase 3, the enzyme that breaks down cyclic AMP. Okay, so stick with me here. So instead of generating more cyclic AMP by stimulating a receptor, Milrinone stops cyclic AMP from being degraded or broken down. The effect is the same, right? The downstream effect is more cyclic AMP, more protein kinase A, more calcium, stronger contraction. But because it bypasses adrenergic receptors entirely, Milrinone keeps working even when those receptors are downregulated after days of beta agonist exposure. So that's why it's useful when somebody has been on dobutamine for a while. So in vascular smooth muscle, elevated cyclic AMP inhibits contractility. So both drugs vasodilate. That's why they're called inodilators, and often why you need norepinephrine running alongside them to keep your MAP from falling. Okay, so in summary, the framework, right? Alpha 1, G alpha Q protein, IP3 and DAG, calcium out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, smooth muscle contracts, vasoconstriction, SVR goes up. Now, beta 1, it's G alpha S protein, cyclic AMP and protein kinase A, calcium into the myocardium, stronger, faster contraction, and again, cardiac output goes up. So beta 2 also raises cyclic AMP, but in smooth muscle, that inhibits kinase, right? So relaxation, bronchodilation, vasodilation. And the V1 receptor, GQ protein, same calcium cascade as alpha 1, vasoconstriction, but no heart rate effect. And PDE3 inhibition, right? Cyclic AMP is preserved instead of degraded, inotropy in the heart, and vasodilation in smooth muscle. So every vasopressor plugs into this similar framework. So when you walk into an interview and your interview wants you to walk through for this cascade for any drug, this is what you need to discuss. This is the level you need to get down to. This is showing them that you're ready for this grad school level receptor physiology. So if you want to go deeper on this before your interview, or you're just interested in this type of pathophysiology and pharmacology, we have a ton of educational for you inside the CRNA Club platform. We have full vasopressor lessons, dosing comparison tables, clinical decision frameworks, and our mock interview tool there as well is excellent for you to practice speaking some of this stuff out loud. I'll leave the links below in the description. All right, and if this helped you, don't forget to subscribe. We're going to be putting out more podcasts and videos every week. And drop a comment below on any questions you have about getting into CRNA school. I read all of them. All right, see you in the next video.